Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much, Larry, for that very kind introduction, and thanks to Georgia Tech for bringing me down. It's really a treat to be with you this afternoon, and as I think that brief bio made clear, I've spent the last 10 years or so of my career focused on questions of political and economic change in the Arab world, and found myself sitting in the catbird seat, in a way, when I came to work at the State Department in November of 2009 as a Deputy Assistant Responsibility in the Near East Bureau was to coordinate our democracy and human rights policy in the Middle East. And lo and behold, a little over a year after I got into the job, the people of the region decided to take me up on that. So it was a fascinating experience and also a fascinating opportunity to test a lot of the ideas that scholars had developed about political change in the Arab world, how and why it might come about, what it might mean for the United States. And here we are years after the Arab awakening began, and I don't like to say after the Arab Spring, because I think in many ways we're 2 years into something that is by no means over. But I thought what I could do in the next little while is talk to you a little bit about the implications of these changes for the United States. And I think it's important that we take the opportunity to do this. I think it's an opportune moment to do so for a couple of reasons I'll explain. How many of you watched the State of the Union address a few weeks ago? Ah, that's so heartening. See, in Washington, you know, it comes a week after the Super Bowl, and for us it's kind of like the Super Bowl because we're a company town, so you know, you pop your popcorn and settle down on the couch to watch the political theater of the State of the Union. But of course, if you're a foreign policy expert, the State of the Union is often very disappointing because there isn't much foreign policy content in most State of the Union addresses. And this year was no real exception in that regard. But President Obama did have a couple of really significant, or I would think, notable things to say about foreign policy in the State of the Union. He announced first that he'd be bringing 34,000 troops home from Afghanistan before the end of this year. I noticed both on election night and in President Obama's second inaugural address, the line that got the loudest applause from the assembled crowd was the one where he talked about closing the door on a decade defined by 2 wars in the Muslim world. And so the announcement about bringing 34,000 troops home from Afghanistan, I think, was quite significant in response to what is the clear sentiment of the American people, that they want to put these wars behind us. In the State of the Union, President Obama did another salient fact, which is that America's new and growing production domestically of oil and natural gas means that at long last we may approach the goal we once thought was impossible, which is becoming an energy self-sufficient nation. And it seems to me these two things, the drawdown of American troops from Iraq first and now Afghanistan, and the prospect of energy independence, in theory, have the potential to fundamentally reshape America's approach to the world, and especially to the Middle East. Since the 1956 crisis over the Suez, and especially since the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s, the United States has been the predominant military, political, and economic power operating in the Middle East. To ensure the free flow of energy to Western markets, to protect our friends and allies, for a long time to contain the Soviet Union, and more recently to push back terrorists who want to target Americans, the United States has invested a great deal of blood and treasure in the Middle East. We've built military bases, we've brokered peace agreements, we've gotten deeply involved in regional politics. So we're at a moment today where we can ask ourselves, and I think implicitly the President was asking the other week, are we now at a point in our own national development where we can begin to set that burden down? Can we undertake what's called a pivot to East Asia and focus on innovation and investment here at home? Does the Middle East still matter to the United States in ways that will continue to demand our attention? And that's the question I want to try and explore with you. When we look at the daily newspapers, the Middle East looks more unstable, more troubling than ever. How much of what's happening right now was avoidable? How much of it is the result of things the United States did? And how much does this instability, this turmoil, matter to America and to the rest of the world? So hopefully we'll get a little bit of insight to bear on those questions in the next few minutes, and then I'll look forward to a discussion with all of you. Now, just a little more than 2 years ago, on January 14th, 2011, I was flying back from Doha, Qatar, to Washington after organizing a visit to Doha for Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, who was my boss. I had been the State Department's point person for something called the Forum for the Future, a summit between the G8 countries and the Arab countries to talk about political and economic reform. And Secretary Clinton gave the keynote speech at this Forum for the Future on January 13th, 2011. She talked about unemployment, she talked about corruption, she talked about depleted natural resources, and she said, in too many places, in too many ways, the region's foundations are sinking into the sand. Now, the leaders of the Arab countries who were gathered around this large conference table at the Forum for the Future were surprised by the fierce urgency of her tone, but they all knew what she was talking about. For 3 weeks already, protesters had been marching in the streets of Tunisia, calling for their dictator to leave. Now, Tunisia had always seemed to all of us Middle East specialists as the most stable and successful of police states. It was repressive, but it was quiet. It had a growth rate of 9% in GDP over the few years leading up to the revolution. It had close trade and tourism ties to Europe. And yet, the very day after Secretary Clinton spoke those words in Doha, the Tunisian army refused to put down the protests, and Tunisia's dictator, Ben Ali, got on a plane and fled the country. The trends that Secretary Clinton was describing on January Day in Doha 2 years ago, the trends that produced what we now call the Arab Awakening, were not new phenomena. They had been building all across the Arab world for a decade or more. And since Ben Ali fled Tunisia, of course, we've seen revolution in Egypt, we've seen another revolution in Libya, a negotiated transition in Yemen, we've seen popular protests in Bahrain crushed by government forces backed by Saudi Arabia, and we've seen what began as a peaceful uprising in Syria transformed by the brutality of Bashar Assad into a bloody rebellion. Now, as I see it, there were 3 deep, long-building trends in the Arab world that helped lead to the stunning changes that we've witnessed over the last 2 years, and that I believe will continue to shape this region for the long term. The first trend is demographic. The region is under 30. 1/3 of Egypt's 82 million people are between the ages of 15 and 29. That's one generation, 1/3 of the population. Now, these as a whole are healthier and better educated than any generation of Arabs that came before them. But despite these advantages, they have faced a massive gap between their aspirations for themselves and their communities and the realities that they faced all around them. Youth unemployment across the region is staggering, and it's a problem even in wealthy countries like Saudi Arabia. But unemployment, when you're a young person in the Arab world, doesn't just mean that you can't get a job. It also means you can't move out of your parents' house. In a context where the average family has to save up 2 years' worth of income to afford the costs of marriage, no job means you can't get married. And if you're from a conservative family or a conservative community, you're not dating either. So you're basically stuck in adolescence. You can't begin to live like an adult. Your whole life is on hold. And if, as a society, if as a government, you don't succeed in integrating those young people into the adult world, then you are in trouble. Anywhere around the world where you have a lot of unemployed or underemployed young men in a society, it is an indicator of instability. Sometimes it manifests as drug addiction, sometimes it manifests as rising crime rates, sometimes it manifests as revolution. A China specialist wrote a book on this phenomenon in China a few years ago called Bare Branches, about the disproportionate number of young single men in China and the implications in society. So for too many young people across the Middle East, there were no real opportunities for work, for marriage, for a better future, no chance at having a voice in shaping that future. Too many people, not only young people, were alienated, frustrated by the disconnect that existed between government and citizens. And across the region, people began to voice their demands for change. So that first trend, demography. The second long-term trend that combined with that rising youth demographic is economic stagnation. Across the region, in rich states and poor, people were seeing their economic opportunities limited by nepotism, by bloated government bureaucracies in which you had to pay bribe after bribe to get very simple things done, and by large-scale corruption in which contracts and deals went to the well-connected, and the money that governments put into projects that were meant to benefit people did not always translate into actual benefit. Opportunities for young people in many places in the Middle East still today are defined not so much by what they know, but by who they know, or more often by who their dad knows or who their uncle knows. And in rich states and poor over the last few years, even in countries with strong macroeconomic growth like Tunisia, inequality was growing. Corruption and state control meant that some were benefiting disproportionately from that growth and others were held back. And so across the region, corruption has become an issue with tremendous resonance in the events of the Arab awakening. Now, if you know anything about the Middle East, then you know that for the most part, the governments in this region don't get their income from taxes. They get it from rent, what we call rent in political science, oil resources, foreign aid, remittances from citizens who are working abroad. And governments are the source of most social goods, healthcare, education, jobs. The largest employers are governments, the ones who offer the most job security, the most benefits. In the past, this was a system that worked very well for these autocratic governments in ensuring people's loyalty and binding citizens to the state by making a kind of social contract. You keep quiet and we will provide the services you need. But as populations grew, and as corruption grew, and as inequality grew, governments became less and less efficient at distributing those resources in ways that kept people loyal and bound to the state. And that became an additional source of instability. Now, the third trend that contributed to the Arab awakening was the rise of new media. And by this, I don't just mean Twitter and Facebook, although there's been reams of paper produced on the effects of Twitter and Facebook and social media on the Arab revolutions. Clearly, they played an important role in helping people organize protests and share information despite government repression. But I'm actually even talking about old new media, things like satellite television and the good old World Wide Web. The expanded access to information that these old new media made available over the last decade or so meant that young Arabs today are more globally aware than the generations that came before them, just as young Americans today are more globally aware than the generations that came before them. And young Arabs became more aware of what separated them from others like them around the world. So if you were a young Egyptian and you were educated to believe that your nation, alongside India and Indonesia, was one of the great leaders of the non-aligned movement, one of the great leaders of the developing world, you could see how India and Indonesia were progressing economically, and Egypt was not. Now, as I said, each trends, demographic, economic, technological, over years. They're deep-seated phenomena. And what that means is that the pressures for change that they've produced are likewise deep-seated. They're not going away anytime soon. That pressure for change might be able to hold it back for a while, but in the end, I don't think they will succeed. The other important thing to recognize is that these trends are evident to different degrees and in different ways all across the Arab world. In small states and large, in rich states and poor, in states with homogeneous populations, in states that contain very diverse populations. What that means is that there is no country in the Arab world today that I would argue is free from these pressures for change. The pressures may manifest in different ways, leaders may respond in different ways over different timelines, but there's no immunity. So while we've seen major change already in Tunisia and Egypt, Libya, Yemen, ongoing conflict in Syria, I would argue that there are still eggs left to crack, if you will, in the region. And the political leaders who are still standing are looking around trying to figure out how to ride this tiger. If they try to reform, can they get ahead of popular demand? Or will they just unleash pent-up public frustrations and get swept away themselves? How do they know? 2 years ago, the story of the Arab awakening seemed like a very simple, clear, hopeful narrative. Dictators toppled by peaceful people power revolutions. When you look at what's happening across the Middle East today, it is a much more complicated picture. There's no simple narrative. In those countries that have ousted presidents and tried to elect new ones, we are seeing some of the initial victors of those elections, parties that may not themselves be really that committed to democracy or even to basic equality. In Libya, Western intervention helped to save Libyan citizens from a brutal dictator, but the loose weapons, the mercenaries, the other spillover effects from that conflict and from Gaddafi's collapse helped contribute to the instability in Mali, the coup in Mali, the rise of jihadi groups there. In Syria, what began as peaceful protest, as I said, was met with astonishingly brutal violence by the regime and is now increasingly transforming into a festering civil conflict with sectarian overtones that could get more and more to look like Bosnia did in the 1990s. It's a complex and a worrisome picture. And yet, the fundamental lesson that Secretary Clinton drew in January 2011 as the Arab awakening was getting underway was correct. An understanding that the old foundations of stability in the Middle East had crumbled out from under our feet. They were gone, and they were not coming back. The Middle East is not going to find a new equilibrium without reforms that build a new kind of relationship between the governments in the region and their citizens. Now, for the United States, this presents a dilemma. We've long favored stability in this part of the world. Stability that would allow the free flow of energy markets, the free flow of commerce through the Suez and of our Navy through the Suez. the stability of peace between Egypt and Israel and Jordan, that has spared those countries from another of the bloody wars that they fought every decade between 1948 and 1979. Our fundamental interests in this region have not changed, but the environment within which we have to try and pursue those interests has clearly changed radically. And so on May 19th, 2011, President Obama gave a speech about these changes. He said, "We have a stake not just in the stability of nations, but in the self-determination of individuals. The status quo is not sustainable," he said. "Societies held together by fear and repression may offer the illusion of stability for a time, but they are built upon fault lines that will eventually tear asunder. It will be the policy of the United States," he said, "to promote reform across the region and to support transitions to democracy." So, if we want stability to allow us to pursue our interests while closing the door on a decade defined by 2 wars, then we need to support change. That sounds a little paradoxical, but in today's Middle East, that is the reality we face. How do we do this? Well, the United States can't control what happens, but that doesn't mean that we don't have a stake in the outcome. We need to recognize that change is messy. Transitions are uncertain. Many democratic transitions fail. So we have to act for the long term, not the short term. And we need to hold to what we've learned and what other societies have learned about what makes for stable, successful democratization. Guaranteed individual rights, neutral courts of law that treat all citizens equally, government institutions that are transparent in the way they do business, and thriving political parties and civil society that give citizens real choices and real ways to participate. Now, in those places where revolutions have already happened, reform is not the question. The question is how to build stable, successful democracies. There are very different forces competing to define the future of these new states. They're competing through elections, but they're competing in other ways too. Some of these forces are democratic, some are not, some we really can't tell yet. And there are also those actors in and around the region who don't want to see stable democracies succeed in Egypt and Tunisia, because that would threaten their interests. What role is there for the United States in places like Egypt and Tunisia and Libya that have undergone revolutions and are seeking now to write new rules for new democratic societies? Well, the U.S. needs long-term cooperation with these countries, especially with Egypt. Egypt is geostrategically located. It is the largest Arab country by far in terms of population. It's a powerful political and cultural and potentially economic force in the region. So the U.S. needs to build broad relationships across Egyptian society, across Egyptian political spectrum, and create a coalition for cooperative ties with the United States, in much the way that the U.S. had to do in Western Europe after World War II, when, in the ashes of that conflict, very different visions for the future were being set out by communists and socialists and conservative Christian Democrats. And there were those who wanted a tight connection to the United States, and those who wanted France to go its own way, and those who wanted to ensure that they had peaceful relations with the Soviet Union looming next door. And the United States had to work across societies and build coalitions of support for transatlantic ties. That's the kind of moment we're in the Arab world today. Now, in other parts of the region, places like Jordan or Morocco, there are kings who are trying to get ahead of the curve of popular demand by making reforms from the top down. In both Jordan and Morocco, those kings have revised their constitutions, they've given more power to parliament, they've held new elections with international monitors observing them. The question is whether they've done enough to address the challenges they face, not just the demand for participation, but also the economic challenges. It's a lot easier, actually, as a monarch to revise the Constitution than to throw your corrupt friends and relatives in jail and to make your courts work fairly to enforce contracts. And the danger is that if citizens are given more democratic institutions and more ways to participate by their monarchical rulers, but these new democratic institutions can't deliver because the monarchs don't do the other things they need to do, then people start to lose faith in politics as a way of getting what they need and solving their problems. And, of course, there are always those waiting in the wings when people start to lose faith in politics and whispering about other ways to get things done. Those radical voices are out there, hoping to see these experiments in reform fail. Places like Saudi Arabia, or they're tinkering around the edges, but really don't want to have to change the way they do business. Since the Arab Spring began, Saudi Arabia has spent billions of dollars. This is a population of about 22 million people, in domestic subsidies to try and address people's grievances, housing subsidies, thousands of new government jobs, and so on. But it's still facing protests every week from women who want to be able to work outside the home or just drive their kids to school, from parents whose children were arrested years ago on suspicion of radical sympathies and have never been released, from locals who know that official corruption is what's caused their problems, but they can't get anyone in the royal family to address it. Saudi Arabia is sitting on 25% of the world's proven oil reserves, and young Saudis are not going to sit there and wait forever. So the United States needs to keep pressing for meaningful reforms because we believe that given the changes that have taken place already, reform is the only path to lasting stability. But the problem is that seeing what's happened all around them, the region's remaining autocrats increasingly worry that reform just upsets the apple cart. And so at a moment of profound uncertainty, there is a real divergence and interests between the United States and some of our most important Arab partners. Let me, in my last few minutes, talk a little bit about a part of the region that I know is on a lot of people's mind these days, which is Syria. Syria has sadly become a fulcrum for all of the forces around the region. They're all trying to influence outcomes to their own advantage. The radical jihadists who reject democracy and reject the West are offering desperate Syrians extra soldiers for the cause in hopes that they can make Syria the new cause célèbre of the jihadi movement and get recruits and money from all around the Muslim world. And since the U.S. withdrawal from Iraq, since the announcement of the planned U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan, and since the relatively successful degradation of al-Qaeda's capabilities in Afghanistan and Pakistan, the jihadis need a new cause. Syria is a great target for them. And it's partly a great cause because in Syria they get to recruit for their ideology, but they also get to fight against Shia. The minority leadership of Syria are Alawi, which is a sect of Shia Islam, although not all Shia see them as a part of Shia Islam. But they get to fight against Shia, they get to fight against Iran. Now, the Iranians, of course, are lined up behind Bashar al-Assad, their longtime ally, because Syria is their link to the heart of the Middle East. It's their link to the border with Israel and the Arab-Israeli conflict. It's a key way they get weapons to Hezbollah in Lebanon. So losing Syria would be a big blow to Iran at a moment when they're already feeling very squeezed. So they are very dug in support of this terrible regime. The Russians and the Chinese don't love Bashar al-Assad, and at bottom, they understand that this guy is not going to survive. But they really hate the idea of approving or allowing another international intervention into a country's sovereign affairs. After all, they have their own restive populations that they sometimes repress with force. And to them, this whole Arab awakening shows the danger of letting people have their say. Look at the chaos that's been unleashed all across the region. Order to freedom. That's one of their core principles in foreign affairs. And they don't agree with the U.S. view that without more freedom in the Arab world, there won't be any order over the long term. And then you have the Gulf Arab states that want to hurt Iran by toppling Bashar, but they also don't really want to deal with another emerging democracy in the region. So they're funding the opposition, but the most conservative Islamist part of it, including some of these jihadi groups. Syrian people and their political football in this regional balance. 1,000 people have been placed. The United States wade into this conflict. Note that what happens in Syria and how it happens will have, of course, an impact on the regional balance of power as the United States is confronting its nuclear program. It could weaken Iran. That could make them more amenable to negotiations. It could also make them more likely to lash out using terrorism and other asymmetric means. It does matter. Now, there are that the most important principle the United States can bring to the issue of Syria is the Hippocratic principle, first do no harm. The problem for the United States is that doing nothing is also a choice that carries consequences. The longer this conflict goes on, the worse it could get. And it's gone on already long enough and in ways that are producing negative impacts on American interests. If the Syrian state collapses into ungovernability, we have to worry about the danger of parts of this territory becoming a haven for jihadi activity. We have to worry about the security of Syria's stocks of chemical and biological weapons. The longer the conflict goes on, the more refugees flow into Lebanon, into Jordan, into Iraq, into Turkey. We have to worry about the impact on the stability of those countries. And should the Syrian conflict truly become entrenched as a sectarian Sunni-Shia conflict, that also will have implications for the very fragile stability in Iraq, where the United States invested so much blood and treasure to tamp down an incipient civil war. So the bottom line is that even if the Obama administration wants to avoid doing harm, that doesn't mean it should avoid doing anything. And the longer the conflict goes on, the more the costs of doing nothing to the United States and its interests. That's a lot to cover. I haven't even mentioned another issue in the Middle East that has often caught the United States up intensely. That's the Arab-Israeli conflict, of course, and the efforts to resolve it. I'd be happy to talk to you about that in the discussion. Let me just end with what I think is the lesson I take away from this little overview, which is that while the American public and President Obama may very much wish to close the door on a decade of entanglements in the Middle East and the broader Muslim world, while we may wish to focus on issues here at home, we may wish to pivot to economic opportunities in Asia, I think you see that there are a lot of reasons why the United States will continue to be drawn in to engagement with a set of Middle Eastern problems that will have profound impact on American interests, on the global economy, and on global security. And so with that, let me stop and look forward to our discussion. Thank you.
She's going to handle the questions herself, and when you guys start with the question, also please introduce yourself. And let you guys ask questions.
Go ahead.
Later.
Mike Gomez. You used the term, the lives and the money that was spent in Iraq to tamp down the incipient
Civil War.
It's amazing, since we have quote-unquote pulled out, how we don't hear anything anymore about what's going on in Iraq.
But of course, there is still violence in Iraq.
So
yeah.
what would the state of that nation be like? Where are they in the democratic movement, the Civil War, strategic relationships with the United States, the oil, and those kind of things? If you would share that.
Sure. That's a good place to start. It's true that there is still sectarian violence in Iraq, and indeed we've seen a bit of an uptick since the Syrian conflict erupted. Now, how much of that is due to what's going on next door, I don't know. We do know that there is a flow of jihadis, of Sunnis from Iraq, who fought in Iraq and conducted bombings against the U.S. and bombings against Shia in Iraq going into Syria. And that's a reverse of what we saw when was troubled, of jihadis from elsewhere in the world. So that's something we need to worry about. Prime Minister Maliki has successfully kind of put a lock on national politics with his Iraqiyya party, which is he's a Shia political leader, and Iraqiyya is a Shia party. And he's used his lock on the executive in some troubling ways, including repressing media freedom, including arresting and prosecuting political opposition, and one of the vice premiers, who is a Sunni leader. So that's all quite troubling in terms of the longer-term prospects for Iraq and for Iraqi democracy. The flip side is that some things we were really worried about have not happened. The Sunni-Shia conflict has not re-erupted in some of the ways we feared, although, as I said, it's still there under the surface. The big thing that hasn't happened is an outright confrontation between Iraqi Kurds and the rest of the country. The Kurds have not tried to declare independence. We have not seen a hot conflict over the territorial dispute around the city of Kirkuk. And we have seen a lot of willingness on both sides to bargain, to negotiate, and to find a way forward where they can both benefit from foreign investment in the oil industry and the other benefits of stability in Iraq. So, I guess that's a hopeful piece that I would relate. Other questions? Sir.
My name is Charles Hubert. I have a couple of questions about Syria. The Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov always been making settlement in Syria. I believe years party to this, and part of it involved Assad remaining in power while and even possibly having this. The United States was a party to it, but has apparently rejected it since that time, and Lavrov was quite critical, saying that Geneva communique was the most likely road to settling things in Syria. And just recently I've heard that there may be some consideration of the United States going along with something that would involve Assad remaining in power during these negotiations. I wonder, what is the status of that? What do you think the likelihood of success of that is? And what can we expect to happen? The next question I have is a quick one. What do you think the possibility of a final resolution involving the partition of Syria into different countries?
Okay. Well, first on the diplomatic initiatives, what you're referring to was, I think, a 6 or 7 point plan put forward by the UN Special Envoy for Syria, Kofi Annan, when he held that position about a year ago now. He resigned and been replaced by Envoy Lakhdar Brahimi. That 7 point plan was an effort to try and get phased agreement that would first involve a ceasefire and a separation of forces and humanitarian access and so on, and then involved a set of political negotiations over the future of Syria between the government and the opposition. There were a couple of big problems with this initiative, which all the members of the UN Security Council signed on to initially. The first big problem is that the ceasefire only lasted about 3 days because Bashar al-Assad didn't keep it. Even during that period of time, he would not fully implement the terms as they had been laid out. And so it never progressed to phase 2 or phase 3. They never got beyond phase 1. Diplomat premised on the idea that Assad would be willing to engage, Assad and his government would be willing to engage seriously with the political opposition, with the Syrian opposition about real political change, real change to the system. In open elections. The political opposition made clear from the beginning their view that Bashar al-Assad, given the way he had behaved, was not a credible interlocutor in this process, and that from their perspective, one key conclusion had to be that he would no longer be president. Assad, I think this diplomatic initiative as it was laid out by Kofi Annan is basically irrelevant at this point. Assad has rejected it in a bunch of speeches where he's put out his own proposals on the political future of Syria that have no overlap with the proposals of the opposition. The opposition for a long time rejected, after this failed gambit, negotiations with the regime, although just in recent weeks some members of the opposition have said they would be willing to negotiate with the regime. And it was also premised on the idea that Russia, which had a good relationship with Bashar al-Assad, could get him to adhere to the demands of the international community. And what we've seen instead is that even when the Russians have tried to exert influence, he has not responded. And so if there's a sort of if there's a way for the great powers to come in and exert their influence on the two sides of this conflict and force them to the table, that probably would have happened by now. But nobody's been able to make that happen. And so I think there are a lot of us who watch the current diplomacy, Secretary Kerry going back to Lavrov and saying, come on, let's see if you and I could find a way to work this out. We look at that with a lot of skepticism. Because personally, I think even if Lavrov and Kerry could agree on an approach, neither of them would be able to enforce that approach on the Syrian opposition or on Bashar al-Assad. So I doubt at this point that there would be political negotiations over Syria's future until the point where the sides that are fighting on the ground get to what we call a herding stalemate, where they're exhausted and they can't gain any more relative to one another through violence. Then they might be willing to talk. And, you know, ultimately, that's what happened in Bosnia with some interventions from the outside to help it along. But that's not where we are in Syria right now, unfortunately. Could Syria break up into mini-states, ethnic enclaves? It could. The populations in Syria are so intermingled and have been for so long that it would be a very messy business and probably a very bloody business. And I don't think we should look at that as something that would end the fighting. I think that as in the breakup of Yugoslavia, you might just see more conflict along the boundaries of those ethnically defined areas. Yes, ma'am.
Worry, beside the tragedy of what's happening in Syria and the devastation, is that this could spill into a wider regional war, is it not?
Well, it's in essence a proxy war already.
All right, so as part of that, since we know Iran is allied with Assad, we know that they're sponsors of Hezbollah and Hamas, what is the probability, in your opinion, that Hamas will take over the West Bank the way they did Gaza? Either, however, and what is your thought? And if that happens, what does that mean for Jordan? What does that mean for, quote, the peace process with Israel?
Could you repeat?
So the question was about Hamas, which gets support from the Iranians, as does Hezbollah and as does the Syrian regime. And so the question was essentially, will Hamas take advantage of the current situation to try and win control of the West Bank? Now, this gets us into what's happening in Palestinian politics these days and what's been the impact of all this stuff going on in the rest of the Arab world on Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza. Because, of course, Israel and Palestine are not walled off from the rest of the region. And so this mood of popular protest has had implications in both Israel and Palestine as well. In Israel, of course, we saw the social protest movement in the summer of 2011, the sort of Occupy Tel Aviv, which resulted in the emergence of a new party that is the second largest party in the Israeli parliament now. And on the Palestinian side, you saw a renewal of mass mobilization in support of unity, in support of reconciliation between Fatah and Hamas, between the West Bank and Gaza. And a lot of frustration, especially among young Palestinians who felt that their political leadership is disconnected from them. It got elected, but it was a long time ago, and it hasn't faced another election since. And so they feel that their political leadership is in many ways as unaccountable and unresponsive to them as those of the Arab autocrats to citizens in Egypt and Tunisia. And so it has produced an upsurge in mobilization in the West Bank and in Gaza. Now, what will be the outcome of that? I don't think that a Hamas takeover of the West Bank is by any means a given. I think that Hamas has done itself a lot of damage in terms of credibility in Palestinian eyes because of the way it's governed Gaza, because it broke its promise to the Palestinian people, as Hezbollah broke its promise to the Lebanese people, that it would never turn its arms on the Palestinian people. And it did. It took over Gaza by force. It persecuted its political opposition. It pushed people off buildings. And it's ruled Gaza with a lot of repression. And Palestinians know that. So as much as they don't blame Hamas for everything that's going wrong in Gaza, and they know that the economic devastation there is much more due to the isolation by Israel and the fact that they don't get international assistance the same way as the West Bank and so on, they do know what Hamas's sins are. They are not blind to that. But of course, the PLO has not covered itself in glory in the West Bank either. So it's a bit of a pox on both your houses, but will you guys both grow up, get over yourselves, and get your act together, I think is how I would summarize the sentiment of a lot of younger Palestinians right now. Now, the question is whether they see any prospect of positive political change in the situation they face today. And I think, most of them believe with good reason that it's unlikely that reconciliation would proceed unless Fatah and Hamas thought they had something to gain from the process. And what would they have to gain? Progress toward Palestinian statehood and Palestinian sovereignty, a state to govern. That's the ultimate political prize. Hamas and Fatah are not competing to become the mediators of the Israeli occupation in the West Bank. That's not what they're aspiring to. So there's a very organic link between the diplomatic process, which is essentially stagnant, and domestic politics in Palestinian society. And I think we ignore that link at our peril. The United States and others in the international community have invested millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars, over the last several years in helping improve governance in the Palestinian Authority and building the institutions of the Palestinian Authority. And a lot of things have gotten better. They've done work on anti-corruption. They've improved rule of law. They've improved the delivery of healthcare and education and other social services. But without a political horizon, without a prospect of independent statehood, all of that institution building only gets you so far. And it doesn't remove the underlying source of instability and grievance, which is the lack of sovereignty. So the diplomatic process, the Oslo process as we knew it, the peace process of the 1990s, may not work anymore for the Palestinian leadership and the Israeli leadership, given who they are, given who their constituents are, and their domestic politics and so on. But that doesn't mean that we can just let it sit. We need to build a new diplomatic process that will meet these guys where they are today and help create a horizon that can ensure continued stability and hopefully, ideally, conflict resolution between Israel and the Palestinians. Ken.
Yeah, Ken Stein, Emory University. You, excuse me, you very well laid out three trends: demography, economic stagnation, and the rise of new media.
Mm-hmm.
They're not going to go away. They're going to be there for umpteen years to come. And maybe...
maybe the middle one we can do something about over time.
If you believe there's any amount of foreign aid that can really make a difference in rentier states. But that's a different question entirely. Then you went on to say, writing new rules for these democratic societies is what we need. And then we need to press for lasting reforms.
Mm-hmm.
Those were your terms. Is it possible to do both of those items when those three, or maybe even the first and the third, don't go away? Can you really press for reforms when you don't have a political horizon? Because we don't have political horizons in Egypt and Tunisia. So how is it possible?
I think that's a very good point, which is that Tunisia, I think, is a little bit different. I would distinguish between the two cases. I think one of the biggest problems in the Egyptian transition is that the transition roadmap itself has very little clarity. So there isn't really a political horizon, and people have it has not been clear to individuals, to organizations, to political movements, how you plug in and how and when to invest to get what you want out of the process. So it's very hard to organize politically if you're playing a game of what my colleague Mark Lynch calls Calvin ball. You guys read Calvin and Hobbes, or did you? You know how Calvin and Hobbes used to play this wacky game where they would start playing football, but then one of them would change the rules, and then the other one would change the rules back. That's what the Egyptian transition has been like. Oh, let's have parliamentary elections. But the Supreme Constitutional Court says Parliament has to be dissolved. Okay, let's have presidential elections. But the day before the presidential election, the military council will change the powers that accrue to the presidency, so it will be weak. This is the Egyptian transition. So you're right, it's been very difficult for the actors to figure out how to engage, internal actors and external actors, given that. Tunisia, I think, has been different because there has been a roadmap. They started out with a sort of technocratic government in the immediate wake of the transition. That government was seen as not credible, not safe. It fell. It took them 3 tries before they put together a transitional government that had enough credibility amongst all the political elites that they could fashion a roadmap those elites could agree on. But in Tunisia, they understood that they needed to fashion a roadmap that the elites would all buy into. So they did that. They said, okay, we're going to elect a constituent assembly, it's going to write a constitution, and then we're going to have new elections for everything. And that's the process they're going along with. And because of the precedent that was set there, the rules that they created for writing the Constitution also reflected the need for consensus, not just majoritarianism, but consensus. They have a 2/3 rule for provisions in their new Constitution. Within the Assembly, it has to have 2/3 support. The government that emerged out of the Constituent Assembly elections, it just fell, but it managed a place for quite a while, was a coalition government of 3 parties, 1 Islamist and 2 secular parties. So I think the Tunisian process from the beginning has been a quite different process. It hasn't been perfect, but it's been much more stable in the way it's played out. And I still have relatively good hopes for it. In Egypt, I think we're at a place where all of the political actors are treating this process as a zero-sum game. The Muslim Brotherhood believes firmly that if it can get through these parliamentary elections, it will win, and then it will have electoral legitimacy, and it doesn't need anything else. It pushed through the Constitution the way it wanted it. It has a devil's bargain with the military, and it'll be able to rule. The opposition believes that if they participate in these elections, that is indeed what will happen. They'll be pushed out of the game. But if they boycott the elections, they will be able to deny the Brotherhood electoral legitimacy. And if they push hard enough, they'll be able to force either a new revolution or the military to step in, a new military coup.
So as a follow-up, if you're making U.S. foreign policy in 18 months, and Morsi hasn't conceded, and the rules are constantly changing, should the United States continue to push Morsi? Should the United States step back? Should we do something with our foreign aid? What do you tell the president to do?
Well, funny you should ask. On Tuesday, I testified before the House Foreign Affairs Committee on this very subject. So if you're interested in the details of what I think we should be...
I read it.
Okay. So you're saying what should we do in 18 months if it doesn't work?
Yeah.
Okay. Look, I don't think the United States can afford to walk away from Egypt. I think it's too geostrategically important. I also think that at bottom, the U.S. and Egyptians have a lot in common in terms of what we want from Egypt and what we want from the region. I think there's a very strong foundation for a lasting cooperative partnership. But I don't think that we can build that lasting cooperative partnership through a kind of transactional relationship with whoever's on top. I think we have to build it by creating that coalition I talked about within Egyptian society, by making the case for why U.S.-Egyptian relations are good for both of us. And that does mean talking about the benefits of peace with Israel, and I think most Egyptians know that that peace treaty has brought them 30 years of stability and has protected an entire generation of Egyptians from the scourge of war. And they value that. Even though they don't like Israel and they don't like American policy toward Israel, they know the benefits of that treaty for Egypt. So I think there actually is a good foundation there for us to make that case. I think we have to stay engaged. Like I said earlier, I think we have to be in it for the long term in a place like Egypt. And even though it's very tempting to look at these developments and throw up our hands, I think that's exactly a dangerous thing to do right now. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I'm at Emory University. We have a global health and humanitarian summit every year. We have like the richest man from Kuwait there, and he's all helping Katrina, and he's sitting next to a Jewish guy who's very involved in Israel doing work in Haiti.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder if this might be purely mental, but a way of humanitarian summits throughout the globe and taking people from any ethnic group, any country, who are true humanitarians and truly just want the human species to have peace, health, food, and shelter. And there are those people in every country, but they aren't the ones who get the attention. But if we could give those people the attention and have them cluster together, we might evolve a little differently. Now, as I said, that might be purely manic, but we've seen, you know, the gathering of those types of people, and they all are on a whole different wavelength,
Yep.
and they're from every culture.
Yep. Just for my information, Larry, how much time do we have?
10, 13, somewhere between 10 and 13 minutes.
Okay, good. So we're ending at 1:30 more or less.
Right.
Okay. I think it's a really interesting point, and I would actually expand it beyond humanitarian concerns. I think that we have at Brookings a project on U.S. relations with the Islamic world that we started in the wake of 9/11. And we've used it over the years in a lot of different ways to try and explore the prospect for bringing people together from a variety of sectors and with a variety of passions to work together on common endeavor. And we've done this over the last 10 years. We've had an arts and culture initiative. We've had an initiative on science and technology cooperation. We've had a faith leaders initiative. It's very unusual for a public policy think tank to do that kind of intercultural work, but it's been a fascinating experience for me. And it's underscored, I think, that a lot of the times we as Americans, because we have such a strong sense of our own civic culture, the ideas and values that we collectively cherish as a society and uphold as a society, we often assume that we're more unique than we are, if you'll forgive the modifier. We often assume that the things that define us aren't, in some sense, universal. But it's not true. You know, the way in which we cherish the dignity of the individual, that's a universal. Those young Arabs who are out in the street 2 years ago and now, they want a government that treats them with dignity. They can't just pick them up out of an internet cafe and beat them to death on the sidewalk, which is what happened to a young man named Khalid Said in Egypt in June 2010. That is a universal. Similarly, we all want our families, our communities to have reliable basic security, reliable access to the basic needs of life. We all want our kids to do better than we're doing. And increasingly, I think with the growth of technological tools and with the change in the global information environment and the global economy, as citizens, we have more and more awareness of the ways in which we're interconnected and interdependent. And we have more ability to act on that. So, you know, I have a friend who wrote his dissertation on the emergence of civil society and the development of international law. And he looked at the case of the International Landmine Ban Treaty, which the U.S. has not signed, but never mind. This was a treaty that emerged from the advocacy of civil society organizations connected globally. That was something that, while not impossible a generation ago, the costs of doing that, the transaction costs, were just much, much higher in a pre-new media age. So I think as civil society organizations are able to connect more easily across borders, there's more and more opportunity for the kinds of things that you're talking about. Yes, sir.
Hi, I'm Pamir from Turkey.
Merhaba.
Merhaba. You said that U.S. action in the Middle East would affect American interests. Could you specify American interests, please? And also a quick question. How do you see Turkey in these conflicts in the Middle East?
Yeah, thank you actually for reminding me that I didn't talk about Turkey's role in Syria very much when I was talking about Syria. Maybe you can, I should ask you. But when I said that the inaction on the Syrian conflict implicated American interests in the region, I was primarily referring to the stability of the neighbors, of Syria's neighbors, which include, of course, our NATO ally, Turkey. And not to say that Turkish stability, the stability of the Turkish state, is threatened, because Turkey is a large and very competent state. But it is having an effect on Turkey that your country is absorbing the cost of, what is it now, 100,000 refugees. And more than once, Syrian missiles have come over the border and struck Turkish villages and killed Turkish civilians. So Turkey's facing a direct threat from this conflict already, and that's why NATO sent Patriot missile batteries to Turkey, which are now deployed there, along with some troops from other NATO countries to man those batteries. So we're already threats in certain ways deeper of strategic relations that we cherish and that serve both our interests. The security and stability of Israel is along the interests of the United States. The Israeli-Syrian border, ironically, has been the most stable border Israel has had for many years. And when I was in Israel last May talking to national security officials there about the Syrian conflict, they were very ambivalent. You know, on the one hand, you know, they have no love lost for Bashar al-Assad. On the other hand, they didn't want to see instability on their northern border. When I talk to them now, and I'm going out again in about a week, but when I talk to them now, they're much more anxious about the impact of this conflict on their own security. They're worried about jihadis who might use Syria as a base. They're worried about border infiltration by Palestinian terrorist groups. They're worried about loose weapons. They're worried about weapons transfers to Hezbollah. We've already seen an Israeli strike on a convoy of weapons that was supposedly going from Syria to Hezbollah in Lebanon. And if Israel feels the need to protect its own security interests through direct military intervention, then we could see Israel getting pulled into this conflict. So those, Iraq I already talked about, I think those are the kinds of American interests I had in mind. Now, as far as the Turkish role in Syria, I think this has been very difficult for the Turkish government because the Turkish government had a strong and growing relationship with Bashar al-Assad. This Turkish government, when it came into office, said it wanted to have a no-problems policy with its neighborhood, which hasn't worked out very well with any of the neighbors, actually, but it's worked out particularly badly with Syria. So at the outset of the conflict, the Turkish government tried to use its influence with Bashar al-Assad to get him to moderate and engage with the opposition and failed to move him a millimeter. So it was embarrassing, and it also left them with no leverage because they essentially had to declare him persona non grata and break off their relationship. So I think Turkey finds itself in a position today where it's carrying a lot of risk, but it doesn't have many tools to manage that risk. And that's very unsettling. In the back.
Yes, I'm John Patrick Floyd. I'm a master's student here at the National Affairs Program. Two things that I found interesting. One is it seems that the Syrian opposition has been unable to solidify into one group. You have the exile versus the people on the ground versus the fighters versus the political leaders, and it seems like that's weakened the support for them internationally. And also, we've also seen clashes already between the Syrian rebels and Hezbollah. I was wondering if you saw this conflict migrating over to Lebanon, and anyway, to what degree you see that happening?
Well, let's hope not, because I think Lebanon suffered enough. But it's possible. It is possible, and it's worrisome. I mean, the first thing I would say, I think, is that the Syrian opposition, while still not a model of unitary decision-making, is in a much better place organizationally than it was even 6 months ago. It managed to create a leadership structure that incorporates armed groups as well as the exile opposition, and that incorporates representatives from all of Syria's ethnic and sectarian communities. And that was very important. I do not want to downplay it. It was a huge struggle. And by the way, this is not unusual for opposition groups that are emerging from decades of intense repression that they're very factionalized and they're very mistrustful. And that's because of the experience of intense repression. So we can't blame them too much for the troubles that they've had getting themselves organized. But they have made a lot of progress. I think the real question, there are two questions that I'm focused on right now with respect to the Syrian opposition. One is, if indeed, as it seemed like the reporting around today's Friends of Syria meeting was suggesting, if indeed Western governments are going to funnel more humanitarian and other assistance directly through the opposition to try and get that to the population on the ground, how effective is the opposition going to be in actually delivering aid to people? That will show how well connected the leadership is to the communities inside Syria. And the other question is, if we get to a point where the Syrian regime collapses or gives up, which I think is unlikely, is this opposition going to be able to hold together a transitional government? Is it going to be able to take over the basic functions of statehood and fill that vacuum quickly? Because without that, I think we really do risk state failure in a way that could have spiraling security consequences. Maybe one more quick question. Yes, sir.
Yeah, about the trends that you mentioned, three trends. You didn't mention anything about religion and Islam, but we see all over the region when the new government comes to power, Islamists get the biggest share of power. Even in Syria, the head of Syrian opposition that everybody could agree on was a religious figure. So do you think the revolutions are being hijacked by Islamists, or is it Islam is a trend that's coming back?
It's a really good question to end on, and thank you for asking it. Let me say two things. The first is that the fact that Islamist parties have done well in the first set of elections in these newly open politics should not surprise anybody. And you don't have to take my word on this now, because I wrote about it in 2008. And a lot of other people did. There was a whole special issue of the journal on Islamist parties. And there was a lot of agreement among scholars that Islamist parties would do really well in open politics in the Arab world. Why? Mainly because under decades of repression, governments were very well able to clamp down all the public space for secular parties to organize, for labor unions to organize, for all the bases secular. Couldn't fully clamp down on religious institutions in society because those are so fundamental. And so it's an organizational advantage over every other kind of political party, because they could use religious institutions in society as a basis from which to organize and spread their message. And they did that throughout the decades of dictatorship, and they emerged in the wake of dictatorship much better positioned than anybody else. And they used it, and they won. So we shouldn't be surprised. Question is, are they hijacking the revolutions? Well, number one, if you look at the Brotherhood in Egypt, for example, they're acting like a lot of parties with questionable democratic credentials who first post-transition elections. They're acting like the National Revolution Party in Mexico did after Mexican independence. They're acting like the party that ruled Japan for decades. They victory and their sudden inheritance of the state institutions and state resources to try and entrench themselves in power, to try and write the laws and rules in a way that will keep them winning. There's nothing particularly Islamist about that. It's not, I would argue, not driven by ideology, it's driven by the quest for power. It is not democratic. They're not playing the game in a democratic way. They are violating basic expectations for democratic actors in their prosecution of people for insulting the president, for example, which is undermining political pluralism. It's saying, no, you're not allowed to disagree with us. So there's a lot about it that I find really troubling that could throw a transition to democracy off the rails or into reverse. And that's one of the reasons why my answer to Ken was we have to stay engaged and we have to push. And we have to make clear what those basic democratic expectations are. Thank you so much. This has been a wonderful discussion. Thank you.